Welcome to Woodcademy Episode 4, the second half of our library stand build. Now in Episode 3, we created all of the Bentwood parts and got them ready to use. In this episode, we'll make the top, we'll assemble the frame, we'll fit all of the Bentwood parts as needed, and finish the whole thing. And along the way, I'm going to share with you some mistakes I made, how I corrected them, and how you can avoid them in the first place. So let's get started. We all know that woodworking is inherently dangerous. You can get injured doing it. And that's why you need to read, understand, and follow the rules that come with your tools. We also know that safety glasses and using hearing protection in the shop is a must. Now in this episode, we're going to reduce stock into 1/8 inch strips. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that, but ultimately it's up to you to figure out the best way to do it in your shop with your tools, no matter what I tell you or what anybody else tells you. Your own safety is up to you. Your brain is your best safety device. The top of the bookcase is nothing but a glued up panel. I'm making mine up out of 4 pieces of walnut. They've all been jointed and planed down to 1/2 inch thick. And I'm just going to glue them together into a flat panel. Now that the top's dry, I've scraped off any excess glue that's on here. And I've got a few little spaces where there's a little bit of a ridge between the lines where the piece is glued up. Not a big deal, not a lot, but I'm just going to use a hand plane to quickly smooth that out, take down those lines. It'll save me a little bit of sanding later, and it leaves a nicer finish. Under normal circumstances, I would make a template and then use the template to mill my parts. But I'm not going to do that in this case because there's only the one top. If you're going to make multiples of this project, then by all means, take the time to make a template. But in the time that it's going to take me to make a template, I can actually make the top. So I'm going to skip the template step in this case. Now what I have done is I took the quarter profile that's in the plans and I mounted it to a piece of 1/4 inch material, cut and sanded that out. I made a quarter template. And that allows me to create the 4 corners exactly the way I want them. This is walnut. So I'm going to use a white wax pencil for marking the walnut. It's much easier to see than a pencil line, but it's not terribly precise. So I'm going to start by using a marking knife to actually scribe the template line into the wood that I'm using, the top that I've created. And then I can come in with my wax pencil and mark the visible line. Now we'll take this to the bandsaw, we'll cut the waste away, and then we'll use a drum sander and a disc sander to smooth everything out, and then the top will be shaped the way we want it, and we can do the rounding over. So now I'm ready to round over the top and bottom edges of our top now that it's shaped the way we want it. I could do this at the router table, but honestly it's just as easy to set up a round over bit in my hand router and go to work with that. Now here's the stock that's been prepped for the frame of the book stand. 1.5 inch wide, 1 inch thick. I've got 3 pieces here. I need 2 at 40 inches for the uprights and 2 at 12 inches for the cross members. Pretty straightforward. We're going to use dowel construction, so I don't have to cut anything oversized. I can cut everything to the exact length I want. Once the frame parts are cut to size, both ends of the two stretchers and the bottoms of the two uprights need to be drilled for dowels. The dowels on the bottom of the uprights will be used to attach the feet later. Now the stretchers are going to get centered top to bottom in between the two legs or uprights. So I need to mark these dowel holes somewhere along the center line in between these two pieces. Now, I've made up a couple of spacers that will hold that position, and I'm going to use these dowel centers, which have a point on the end, fit into the dowel hole and have a point on the end that will mark the wood when I squeeze it together where the dowel holes get drilled. It's a pretty simple and effective way to make that work. But first I need to lay out where these are going to go on the main part. Now, considering this to be the bottom, the stretcher is going to be 1 inch off the bottom, which will put the second half of it 2.5 inches off the bottom. And at the top, we're going to be at 6 inches and 7.5. Now I'll just use my square, strike those lines so that I have a visual reference to where these parts are going to go. And because doweling is usually less than terribly accurate, I'm going to mark these with an A and a B and a C and a D. And that way the joints will go back together the way that the dowel centers show me that they need to go. So now I'll disassemble this. I'll use my spacers. I'll squeeze the whole thing together, mark the holes, and then I can drill them. So now I've got a clamp lightly holding C and D together, the top one. I'm going to put my dowel centers in the holes that I've already created. Set that onto my little spacers. Line everything up where I want it. And now by squeezing this together with the clamp, I'll leave 2 pinholes in each side exactly where I want to drill my dowels. The dowel center is a very useful tool to have around your shop. They're not common, but you can find them. So now with the depth on my drill press set to 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to go ahead and let the drill find that point that we made with the dowel center and drill the holes. Prior to assembling the frame, notches need to be cut in the top of both uprights for the mechanism that tilts the top. The notch needs to be 3/8 of an inch deep, running 4 inches down the top of the uprights. If you've got a good dado stack, just set the rip fence 4 inches from the left side of the stack and nibble away the end of the uprights until they hit the rip fence. But if you don't happen to have a dado stack, cut a 3/8 deep kerf 4 inches down from the end of the upright and remove the waste cutting along the shoulder line. The frame's now ready to go together. Now, in the prototype, I used mortise and tenon joints, and this time I'm using dowels, just for a little bit of change of pace, and because the dowels are a little bit simpler. I've got the dowels already inserted into the frame pieces, and now, as I mark the parts before, A, B, C, and D, everything goes together nicely, and it'll be a good, strong frame. Now, if I did my job right, should be able to check the dimensions going across. 42. Oh yeah, nice and square. I'll let that dry. Now here's where it's going to get fun and a little bit interesting, a little bit complicated. I want these two parts to come together in the center. I'll put a dowel joint across here eventually once I get it all figured out. But I also need to adjust them so that my center is in the center and the four corners meet where I want. Now, in an ideal world, this would have happened right out of my clamps or my forms, but it didn't quite work out that way. So now we'll do just a little bit of adjustment. I'm going to put a clamp on all four corners and then just kind of adjust things. And I have a couple of long clamps here in case I need to force these inward a little bit. Once I get it all where I want, I'm going to clamp it off, mark the underside of the part, and then I can cut the two pieces and put it all back together. These parts will actually keep the frame from racking side to side. So through a combination of bringing these clamps in and out to slightly increase and decrease my radius and sliding everything back and forth and side to side, I've come to a point where my center cross piece here is centered between the rails, and the four corners will lock into the notch between the upright and the horizontal stretchers. So now I can clamp these two pieces into place, scribe on the underside, I'll flip the whole thing over, scribe on the underside where the cuts are going to be, and then I'll probably actually hand cut these so that they fit directly in and they should compress each other. I'll also do make a mark here at the very center, drill a dowel joint, and then use my dowel centers. So I'll have a dowel connection here in the center and then a dowel connection on all four after this is all done. All right, so I've used my marking knife to mark the bottoms of all four of these, but in order to make sure that this comes back in exactly where we have it now, I still have my A, B, C, and D markings in the four corners of these joints, so I will mark these pieces the same, and that way everything will go back together the way that I've laid it out. Otherwise, there could be weirdness that happens. I'm also going to put a little mark right across the center there. That's where my dowel will go there. And that should take care of everything we need. So now I'm going to drill one of these, transfer the mark to the other one, drill that, put a dowel in there, cut these four corners so that the curved stretcher will fit right up tight into these four corners, mark those, dowel everything, and it should be fine. Woodcademy is all about helping you build your skills. And what you're going to get here that you don't get in other places is when I screw up, I'm going to share it with you. Now, on the prototype, in order to attach these center stretchers to the frame, I clamped them in place, drilled through, and put a dowel in, so the dowel is visible, but it was an easy way to attach the ends. This time, I decided I wanted to try a hidden nail. Now, that uses this little tool here, which is made by, this one's by Veritas, and it's a little gouge, and when you slide it along a piece of wood, it cuts a little flap of wood that's still attached to the board. I can move it out of the way, drill through, put the nail in, and then glue that back down. And that's what I used here. And it worked very, very well for putting in and hiding the nail. You won't be able to see that nail hole there when I'm done sanding and finishing all of this. The problem is that driving a nail through and into this piece is incredibly hard to clamp into place, and the nail wanted to drive it out away while I was trying to keep it in place. And honestly, this top joint over here is not nearly as good as I would like. I'm going to have to cut a little tiny wedge of walnut, stick it into the gap here, cut it off with a razor knife and hide that. It's a mistake, and it's not the way that you want to build things. So I'm recommending, even though I showed you here using the, that there is no dowel, I'm going to recommend going through with a dowel. Now you can use a contrasting dowel like I did on the prototype, or you could use a plug or a dowel of walnut and have it match very nicely, and there will be a visible item here, but it'll be very, very subdued. Now here's how I did the layout for the feet. I double face taped the two pieces together, and then using a scrap and balancing this or pressing this up against my rip fence, I marked off the two sides, so that'll be the bottom of the feet. And I'll probably round this tip over a little bit so it's not so sharp. Then I measured from point to point, found the center line, and then marked off where the leg will come down inside. So this part right here will get flattened very slightly, just enough to take the leg, and then it'll be drilled for the dowels to match the ones that are in the legs. And then I'll cut this off at the bandsaw, cut these ends off, and then sand up the foot so that it'll sit flat and everything will work. With the feet trimmed and shaped, the dowel centers are again used to transfer the hole locations from the bottom of the uprights to the center of the feet, which are then drilled for dowels as well, and glued and clamped to the bottom of the frame assembly. Now these two little blocks will be the clamping blocks that clamp the brackets to the uprights where we cut those notches earlier, allowing them to turn. So they need to be notched out to accept the brackets. I've laid out a pair of lines, one at 2 inches, one at 1.5. That's the center point of where it's going to clamp. But what we really need to do is to create a curved dado there to allow the bracket to follow the curve so that it angles nicely. So obviously the solution to that is to use the brackets themselves, line them up against those marks so that the top of the arc is in the center, and then we're going to use our marking knife to strike that arc top and bottom. Now this fit can be a little loose because we're going to make it just slightly less than 1/2 inch deep so that it'll clamp the bracket, which is 1/2 inch thick. But we want to have that very slight, it's a 4-inch radius, so it doesn't really show up too much on here, but you can see that it's there. Now, as usual, there are lots of different ways you can do this. I'm just going to use a 3/8 inch Forstner bit to drill a series of holes across the arc right along the center line, and then just chisel away the waste. Now the inside curve I'll remove with a standard chisel because I can. And now I've got that line that I scribed in using the marking knife. So all I need to do is work right up to that line. And now the inside line is best done with a gouge that has a shallow radius on it. And I can just follow this around, nibbling away at it until I get the curve I want. That's looking pretty good. Maybe just a little bit more on the two corners and we'll be set. Now I'm going to be using a set of mirror pivot hardware to use the clamp blocks. On the prototype, I originally built my own. It was horrible, so I went to this particular set. You can buy it from Rockler in the brass, like I have here, or in the antiqued brass, which is black that you see on the prototype photos. I need a 3/8 hole for the nut in the clamp block, but then I need a 1/4 inch hole through the upright in the proper place in order to make it all work. Rather than try to figure that out, the first thing I did was I marked the center of the lower section of the clamp block, drilled a 1/4 inch hole through there. Now I'll use that as my guide to drill a 1/4 inch through the upright for the screw, and then I'll come back and just re-drill that hole to 3/8. Everything will line up and I won't have any problems. Now, just as with the legs, I've got my two brackets taped together, double face taped together, so they'll be the same. But in this case, none of this really matters as much. I've already cut off the extensions, that, the extra length. But now all I need to do is to make sure that these two faces here are on the same plane. It doesn't really matter if it's lower or higher, because the bracket is going to hold it and allow it to move, so there's really no reference point on it, except I need these four pieces, these four faces, to be nice and flat so that they rest on the bottom, they can be attached to the bottom side of the top. So other than that, that's really the only cleanup here, and then we'll just do a little sanding to knock these edges off. And now we're ready for the final setup. I've got the brackets clamped into the clamp blocks, just temporarily using clamps in the position they're going to be. Now we can set this onto our top. Now I'm going to measure from side to side, get this centered, and then once again turn to my trusty marking knife to carefully mark out the four positions where the brackets meet the top. These then get drilled out and a short section of dowel added to each hole. The ends of the brackets get a shallow hole as well, but there's no need for dowel centers on this. The bracket ends are only a 1/2 inch square, so by eye is close enough. Lightly clamp the brackets in place and let them dry. So it's all assembled now. The last step to do is to add a cleat across the bottom, what will be the bottom of our adjustable top, in order to hold the book from sliding off when it's at an angle. So I've made up a part. It's 1/2 inch wide, 12 inches long, rounded the corners and rounded over all the tops. You'll probably notice on some of the prototype photos, I actually glued this up out of 3 pieces, 2 pieces of walnut with the maple accent in the middle, match the accents with the dowels and such, but since this one is more simple, I'm not going to do that. I've laid out the positioning on it here, and I've drilled 2 1/4-inch holes in the bottom for dowels to hold it in place. Now I'm going to simply use my dowel centers to lay this out the way I want. That looks good, so we can just press down a little bit. There's my marks, got my holes. So now I've got my dowels in place, just a little bit of glue on there. Slip that in, clamp it down. That should be all set. Just let it dry, then we can start sanding. Now the last part to note is on the clamp blocks here. Notice that it's at a bit of an angle because I'm pulling here and it's being held there. I don't like the way that looks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little strip of 1/8-inch material right at the bottom here to act as the pivot and keep this more or less aligned as it closes up there. And then I'll also trim off this bolt here just a little bit beyond the nut and smooth the end so that these aren't sticking out to catch people's hands when you're using the stand. Other than that, we're done. We're ready to take it apart, take the top off the frame, sand everything out, round over all the edges, and then apply finish. I mentioned earlier that instead of using dowels through the uprights to secure the curved stretchers, I tried blind nails this time. And the blind nail tool worked really, really well, but trying to nail through into the stretchers, there's no good way to clamp this while you're pounding the nail, and I had some issues with the final fit. So on the top here, there was a little tiny gap, just a hairline. I was able to fill that with putty, no big deal. Down here though, in the B corner that we originally established, the gap's really too big to try and fill with putty. It's going to show if you try to use putty. There's just no 2 ways around it. And because we have a gap here, that means that this joint probably isn't as strong as it should be. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut some very thin, narrow wedge pieces. I'm going to glue the wedges into place and then trim them back so that they appear to be part of the very end of the curved stretcher. So let's see how that works. I've got my blade laid over at like a 2-degree angle, and what I'm really going for is for the off-fall piece to have a little bit wider at the top, but ideally I want the very bottom to disappear to virtually nothing. Now it may take a couple of tries at the table saw before you get this exactly the way you want it, but I can slide this into place here, work it down into the groove or to the gap with a little bit of glue, and then when I trim it off with a knife after the glue dries, it should disappear completely. Finishing this project is no different than any other. It's the usual round of sand, spray, and sand some more. And that's pretty much it for our library stand. I hope you've enjoyed the build. Don't be afraid to apply a liberal amount of wax to the brackets that slide through the blocks. It makes the whole system a lot easier to slide and tilt. In episodes 5 and 6, we're going to be building a set of dining room chairs, which will feature some basic steam bending on the parts. Now, if you'd like to build this project for yourself, a complete set of plans is available for free on our homepage. It includes measured drawings, photographs, material lists, everything you need to make your own version.